Right, I think I found a good place to start. Let's talk about Hong Kong's education system. See, on the exterior, everything seems rather dandy, and numbers tend to back this up, such as the PISA assessment of 2018, which ranks Hong Kong 4th in terms of reading and mathematics and 9th in terms of science. But it would appear these academic rankings have come at a very large cost. Over 40% of local Hong Kong schools don't provide sex ed led by a qualified outsider, and even when they do, the majority focus on heterosexual relationships only. Some students and teachers have had to hide their sexuality, and no one can really blame them. Some 80% of LGBT students reported some kind of bullying or discrimination inside a school environment due to their sexuality. 42% was verbal abuse, 40% reported being socially excluded, and some 14% of respondents said they were sexually harassed or physically assaulted. And when the general public were asked where they believed that the LGBT community faced the most mistreatment, only 9% listed a school environment. I mean, have a look at these articles. A 19-year-old was forced to eat a banana in front of another guy's crotch just because they found out he was gay. So clearly, if this docuseries is going to start anywhere, I'm going to start it with life at school. Now let's rewind a bit and go back to the start, where the root cause lay. Sex ed. Is it really that bad for the LGBT community?
Our school based sex ed almost entirely around biology and around the practicalities of it. There was very little for anything outside of a very straight biological standard of this is what sex is, this is how sex is done.
I think in my time, the sex ed was woefully inadequate, under-researched and uncared for.
The sex ed we get in schools is definitely, it's good, but there are many things that they don't take into account, especially a lot of like trans issues. Because I do remember one time someone asked, well, if a boy's born without a penis, then what does that make him? And the teacher said, well, that makes him a girl, which obviously isn't true because your gender isn't defined solely by your genitals alone.
When we first were given our sex ed talks in early middle school, there was no mention of LGBT issues whatsoever. They only came up in our senior year, so in this past year, where they were kind of glossed over with a few mentions of how to have safe sex with a same-sex partner.
It's severely lacking in the sense that very little of these courses are, number one, involving anything that falls out of the realm of a general heteronormative or heterosexual sort of relationship. So there's no mention of what to do if you're transgender. There's no mention of what to do if you want to, if you're in a gay relationship instead of a straight relationship. And in that case, that's where I think all sex ed kind of lacks.
The school sexuality education in Hong Kong, LGBTQIA plus issues has been missing.
So, surprise, surprise, the schools have actually neglected sex ed, at least to a certain extent. And it turns out, current government policies allow them to do this.
Currently in Hong Kong, there's no official sex education curriculum. There's no official policy that asks the schools to deliver a certain scientific set of sex education. There's only a guideline set up, I think, like maybe more than 20 years ago, and the guideline hasn't been updated.
And it doesn't help that Hong Kong has a rather conservative culture, which means that most local families won't cover topics such as sex ed with their children.
Sometimes it's very difficult for parents to go beyond their own cultural background and then to go into another culture. So this is the most difficult difficult task for them to do.
This leaves students to look elsewhere for sex education.
Don't rely solely on school sex education. The students right now, because of the social media, they can learn about these issues.
Yeah, I think just searching it up, it honestly does a great deal.
I think that there's definitely a mixed bag of things that you'll find on the internet.
Like even the dark sites that we're not supposed to be in. It's, for me, I actually learned something there, but I'm not saying that it's good for everyone.
You learn from what you're exposed to on the internet, and this can come in many forms as so there are often YouTubers who will talk about LGBT sex ed, and that's quite educational, and I would recommend that as a route, although it might be difficult to find reputable sources. There's also the very typical 12-year-old like fan fiction route, which I would not recommend.
Yeah, so be careful. Make sure it's not some 2-subscriber channel, you know what I mean? Like, what is that? Yeah.
It is definitely very fortunate that the internet has allowed information to flow that much easier. This matters a lot because without sex ed, a lot of people can have misconceptions about the LGBT community.
So we have, in our school, we have a clear policy against PDA. And when it comes to a boy and a girl, it's very easy. They just tell them to separate. However, we had this one lesbian couple and nobody would stop them, and I think it's because of straight staff who'd be afraid to come across as homophobic. So they would just turn a blind eye on them and just be like, no, I didn't see it. Until the only teacher I know who once told them, you know, like, hey, can you like chill out before, like while you're still on school site, was gay. And that's why he felt like, okay, he was just like, hey, can you like wait until the end of the day? Like,
this can also lead to LGBT students feeling a little confused about their identity.
The concept of homosexuality was not something that I knew existed. And I feel like if it was talked about at school, then first of all, it would really change the way that I learned about the existence of these things, and therefore my perception of it. If I had learned about homosexuality in a very controlled, safe environment, then it definitely, more likely I wouldn't have such negative connotations with it.
I actually learned about the notion of a fluid gender before I learned about sexuality. So in my head, boys like girls, girls like boys. When I was 13, I fell in love with a girl, and I was like, okay, my feelings for her are so strong, I must not be a girl, I must be a boy. And so I started asking that everyone called me he, but then I found myself really uncomfortable with it because I present myself as very feminine, and back then I was also very feminine.
And worse yet, this can open up avenues for schoolmates to bully them.
There's been a lot of people who give throwaway comments or who might choose to, you know, give verbal abuse instead of any other sort of abuse. And the problem is that with this kind of verbal abuse, it's less likely for people like teachers to really take a stand against it or notice it. So this kind of stuff is very subtle in these communities, but they're still there. So there's still quite a few people who are faced with this discrimination.
In younger years, particularly in year 7 to 9, there are a lot of cases of sexuality-based bullying among students, going as far as death threats. Any discrimination within our school was deemed as a friendship issue or as a social issue. And this went for not only for homophobia, but for things like anti-Semitism, racism. All of these things were deemed as social issues. It completely undermines the person who's being bullied, their experiences, what they're going through. On a personal basis, I would say, it really affects your sense of self and how you see yourself. But it also prevents other students who are facing similar issues to come forward and makes it seem like it's an okay thing to do.
I mean, to begin with, I don't think any school would say okay to bullying, schoolyard bullying. So, I mean, you know, school administrators, they do have a duty to provide a positive learning environment for all kids, irrespective of who they are. So, school bullying, school administrators can do a better job in sending out a very clear message that no matter what, school bullying is not acceptable. There should be a zero tolerance.
The students have to face sexual prejudice and anti-transgender prejudice and homophobia, transphobia, this kind of issues. So under this kind of social stress, they may have some minority stress, mental health concerns, not because of their identity, because of the unsafe environment and also the prejudice and stigma they face in the society.
Set aside poor government policies and the conservative culture, it doesn't help that a lot of Hong Kong schools have religious ties and backgrounds.
Especially Christian and Catholic schools, they still have a very strict policies on educating the students and teachers about LGBT issues. So we don't talk about LGBT issues, especially in some religious affiliated schools in Hong Kong.
因為個問題係唔係就係 culture 嘅問題，呢個係 systemic issue 嚟。Many of the schools are controlled by the churches. I wouldn't say all of them are homophobic, but certainly a good portion of them are anti-LGBT equality because of various reasons, including preserving their privileges. And that's why in schools they suppress LGBT minorities and they try everything not to teach what is factual regarding LGBT populations.
Especially in religious schools, like there's so much that they're just so closed off to, and so much that they're missing out on just because they have certain values that they're too stubborn to let go of.
So unfortunately, the outlook is rather bleak, because without systemic change to government policies or school administration, the situation will remain as it is. But the least we can do here is offer some advice for those facing adversity right now.
Our society demands that we go through trauma in order for us to be valid as who we are, and that's not acceptable. But that will change. But the problem is that change comes slowly, so the pain that you are feeling right now is not something you can control.
Find someone who can help you, whether it be a best friend or a parent or a teacher or a counselor, and that you shouldn't have to live through that because they are telling you that what you're doing is wrong.
Try and find other queer people in your school, and if there is no one who is visibly queer, try and find that online and hang on to those connections.
I don't want to say if you look a little closer you can find them, but that often is the case. There are so many people like you out there.
If you don't feel accepted in school, once you graduate, once you go out into the world, you're gonna find a lot of people like you.
Someday you're gonna graduate, you're gonna become an adult, you're gonna be able to have the freedom to choose who to surround yourself with.
To end this, do you have anything to say to the bullies?
Talk, get hit.
Off. I can't say that, can I?
I don't want to say that word, but you.
Get a life.
I'm sorry. I hope you find peace.
Get therapy.
Focus on yourself before you focus on other people.
I'm really sorry we couldn't end on a higher note, but unfortunately the situation is what it is. But I do hope that government policies and school administration can catch up to the 21st century. Anyways, I would like to thank you for watching this episode of the docuseries. I would also like to thank everyone who helped out in making this episode. That includes all guests who came on to interview, as well as Mansie, Raine, and ISSIA as a whole organization. It's been a huge collaborative effort, and we still have 3 more episodes to present to you. So I hope to catch you next Sunday in the East versus West episode. Hope you take care, and I hope to see you next Sunday. Cheers!